Your vote matters. Breaking free from learned helplessness and taking back control. Now, before I get into this, I do want to put out there, I personally do not care who someone votes for. I think that you should vote, at least in your own best interests, and hopefully you have enough self-awareness to vote in the best interests of your country and in larger the world. However, I do get that there are a lot of people out there that choose not to vote. And so this episode is for them. We just want to clarify, are you not voting due to a psychological concept called learned helplessness? So let's jump into this. Welcome to Information for Life, insight and ideas to navigate your world. The podcast where we dive deep into the insights and research that can help you navigate life's challenges with clarity and purpose. In today's episode, we're breaking down the concept of learned helplessness and how it may be influencing people who choose not to vote. We'll explore the psychology behind this mindset, examine the low voter requirements in local elections, and discuss how even small individual actions can lead to massive change. If you've ever felt like your vote doesn't matter, this episode is for you. In this episode, we explore how learned helplessness can impact voter turnout and engagement. We'll discuss the psychology behind choosing not to vote and how this feeling of powerlessness is not only detrimental, but also based on a distorted view of personal influence. From the low voter percentage requirements in local elections to historical examples where small actions led to big changes, we'll show you why your vote is more powerful than you think. Learn how to recognize and break free from learned helplessness and take back control of your voice in the democratic process. Defining learned helplessness. In the realm of psychology, learned helplessness refers to a state where individuals, after being exposed to uncontrollable and persistent negative events, come to believe they have no power to change their circumstances. This concept was first identified in a series of experiments by psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer in the 1960s. Through their work with animals, they found that when creatures are repeatedly subjected to adverse conditions without an option to escape or alter the outcome, they eventually stop trying, even when opportunities for change arise. This phenomenon extends to human behavior, often manifesting in ways we don't immediately recognize. When it comes to voting, the connection is clear. Many individuals experience a form of learned helplessness where they believe their vote doesn't matter, or that no matter who they vote for, the system remains unchanged. The overwhelming size of the system, feelings of alienation from politicians, or repeated disappointment from past elections can lead to this sense of powerlessness. It's not just about the act of voting, but about believing in one's ability to affect change through that vote. For those who feel disillusioned or disconnected from the political process, learned helplessness can silently dictate their decision to abstain from voting. In this episode, we'll explore how this mindset takes hold, what it looks like in everyday life, and most importantly, how to recognize it and break free from its grip. The psychology behind choosing not to vote. When people choose not to vote, their decision may often be rooted in the idea that their individual vote doesn't matter. The sentiment is especially prevalent in systems where it feels like large corporate interests, political elites, or deeply ingrained structures dictate the outcomes, regardless of what the people want. However, this feeling of political insignificance often masks something deeper: learned helplessness. Learned helplessness in voting manifests when individuals, after years of witnessing little change despite their participation, concludes that they are powerless to influence outcomes. Imagine a voter who has gone to the polls every election cycle only to see their preferred candidate lose or their values seemingly unrepresented. Over time, the voter's repeated disappointment may cause them to stop engaging altogether. Even in elections where the vote could potentially sway outcomes, they've internalized a belief that it won't make a difference. The feeling that drives non-voters aren't always irrational. After all, there are genuine grievances, gerrymandering, vote suppression, disproportionate representation, that can create very real barriers to change. However, it's essential to distinguish between legitimate disenfranchisement and the learned helplessness that makes someone feel that change is impossible even when opportunities for participation are available. This sense of powerlessness can also be reinforced by a culture of political cynicism, where the idea of nothing ever changes is repeated so often that it becomes ingrained. By exploring these psychological drivers, we can begin to understand the subtle ways in which people are nudged towards inaction, not because they lack the ability to vote, but because they've learned to believe that their vote won't count. For many, it's not an active decision, but a passive conclusion born from repeated disillusionment. Historical contexts, voter turnout trends. To understand the broader context of learned helplessness in voting, it's important to look at how voter turnout has fluctuated in recent U.S. presidential elections. These statistics reflect shifts in public engagement and provide insight into potential underlying factors, including learned helplessness, that may contribute to a drop in participation. Here's a breakdown of voter turnout in the last 6 U.S. presidential elections. 2020, 66.8%, the highest turnout since 1900. 2016, 55.7%. 2012, 54.9%. 2008, 57.1%. 2004, 60.1%. 2000, 54.2%. There is a clear fluctuation, with higher turnout in certain election years and noticeable drops in others. For instance, the spike in 2020 could be attributed to heightened political polarization, significant natural events, for example, the pandemic, and movements advocating for civil engagement. Conversely, the lower turnout in 2016 and 2012 may reflect growing political dissatisfaction or feelings of disillusionment. Several factors can influence voter turnout, from access to voting methods, mail-in ballots, early voting, to shifts in political sentiment. However, within these statistics, learned helplessness plays an often invisible role. The numbers alone don't tell the full story. With the millions who didn't vote, many might have felt that their voices couldn't change the outcome, or that no candidate represented their interests. Additionally, there are significant disparities in turnout when broken down by demographics. Historically, marginalized groups, such as lower-income individuals or ethnic minorities, often have lower voting turnout rates. This is particularly due to systemic barriers like voter suppression, but learned helplessness can exacerbate these issues. If someone believes the system is designed to work against them, that belief can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. By understanding these trends, we can begin to unpack how the broader sense of political helplessness evolves, particularly among groups with historically lower participation rates. This context is crucial as we explore how learned helplessness intersects with modern voting behavior. How to recognize learned helplessness in voting behavior. One of the most critical steps in addressing learned helplessness is recognizing when it might be influencing your decision-making. Many people who choose not to vote may not even realize that their disengagement stems from a deeper psychological pattern rather than a well-thought-out choice. Identifying those thought patterns is key to reclaiming personal agency in the voting process. Here are some questions that can help someone reflect on whether learned helplessness is playing a role in their decision not to vote. Have you experienced multiple elections where your preferred candidate or cause lost, leading you to feel discouraged about future participation? Repeated loss can create a sense of futility, especially if you feel like your vote doesn't align with the majority or it never seems to lead to the changes you hope for. This is often a precursor to learned helplessness. Do you find yourself saying, "My vote doesn't matter," or "Nothing ever changes no matter who wins"? These statements are classic markers of learned helplessness. They signal a belief that the system is so vast or corrupt that no individual action, like casting a vote, can make a difference. This belief is often deeply ingrained, making it harder to challenge without conscious effort. Have you stopped following political news or discussions because they feel overwhelming or irrelevant? Disengagement often starts with avoidance. If you've begun to tune out political conversations because they feel hopeless or frustrating, it might be a sign that learned helplessness has crept into your view of politics. Do you assume that all candidates are equally bad, or that the system is rigged so participation feels pointless? While dissatisfaction with candidates or the political system is not uncommon, this mindset can also be a reflection of helplessness. It's easy to become cynical, especially if you felt burned by previous elections or political scandals. But the cynicism can further reinforce inaction. By taking the time to reflect on these patterns, voters can begin to recognize if their disengagement is rooted in genuine dissatisfaction or a deeper sense of helplessness. Identifying this is the first step to breaking free from the cycle and reclaiming the power that voting offers. Just because the system feels overwhelming doesn't mean an individual's participation is meaningless. Quite the opposite. Collective participation can create significant change. Learned helplessness versus rational disengagement. It's important to differentiate learned helplessness from rational disengagement. While learned helplessness is rooted in feelings of powerlessness and defeat, rational disengagement is a conscious decision based on research or principles. Some people choose not to vote because they believe their non-participation sends a stronger message, or they don't align with any candidates or the system as a whole. Understanding this distinction is crucial to avoid labeling all non-voters as helpless. Here's how learned helplessness and rational disengagement differ. Learned helplessness. This mindset is often subconscious and driven by repeated negative experiences with voting or the political process. Or, let's face it, really anything in life. If you're constantly getting with crap people in relationships, you might choose to be single. People with learned helplessness may feel they are powerless to influence any political outcome, even when opportunities to vote exist. Their disengagement is less about a deliberate choice and more about an internalized belief that their actions don't matter. They may want things to change, but feel that voting won't make a difference. Rational disengagement. On the other hand, rational disengagement involves a more intentional decision. Someone might choose not to vote because they believe the available candidates don't represent their values, or they may see non-participation as a form of protest against a system they believe is broken. These individuals are more likely to have considered the consequences of not voting and have made an informed decision rather than feeling overwhelmed or powerless. While both groups ultimately choose not to vote, the underlying motivations are vastly different. Addressing learned helplessness involves helping people see that their participation, combined with others, can indeed shift the political landscape. It requires empowering people to recognize that systemic change takes time, but is still possible with consistent involvement. Rational disengagement, on the other hand, is a valid political stance, one that acknowledges flaws in the system while opting out of participation for principled reasons. However, even here, it's worth exploring whether this choice is truly empowering or if it risks reinforcing the very systems the individual seeks to resist. By distinguishing these two forms of disengagement, we can have more productive conversations about voter participation and address the underlying factors that keep people from engaging with the political process. Call to action, creating self-agency with the individual. The path out of learned helplessness begins with reclaiming a sense of agency. While it's easy to feel like one vote or one action is insignificant, history is full of examples where small, individual contributions led to profound changes. For individuals struggling with learned helplessness around voting, it's important to remember that collective action starts with personal participation. But here's an even more critical piece to consider. In many local elections, the percentage of voters required to enact laws or amendments is shockingly low. Take St. Petersburg, Florida, for example. As of right now, only 8% of the voting population is required for certain measures to pass, and there's currently a ballot initiative to reduce this number to 5%. What this means is that a very small minority of voters can decide on issues that will have real-world, large-scale impacts on everyone else in the area. This is shocking. You would think that it would take 51% of voters' turnout to vote in order to pass something, but it does not. And that is something that I did not realize until I went to vote this year and saw that thing on the ballot to drop it from 8 to 5%. That's insane. We really need to have a system set up where if less than 51% of registered voters in the area turn out to vote, nothing gets passed. They put it on TV, on local news or whatever else, online, Facebook, social media, and say, hey, we had less than 51% of voters turn out. This affects you. Go vote. In a perfect world, right? This 8% of voters needing to pass certain things in St. Petersburg, Florida, highlights how a handful of engaged individuals can have an outsized influence over an entire community simply because more people didn't show up to vote. The decisions of a small percentage of voters could influence local tax rates, public funding, education, and infrastructure, affecting the daily lives of all residents. And I'm talking to myself here as well. I do need to get more engaged in local politics, at least local voting. So I am talking to myself here as well. Many people assume that something as important as passing laws will require at least 51% of the population to participate or agree, but that's simply not the case. Low voter turnout means that a vocal and motivated minority can shape policies that affect everyone. The fewer people that vote, the more power each individual vote holds. Your vote is part of a larger movement. While one vote may seem like a drop in the ocean, when combined with others, it can shift political outcomes. A well-known example is the 2000 U.S. presidential election, where the outcome hinged on just 537 votes in Florida. This incredibly slim margin decided the presidency and the direction of national policy for years to come. It's a powerful reminder that even a handful of votes can change the course of history. And yes, I'm aware that there is discussion around that. That's not what I'm getting into today, because at the end of the day, I don't care who you vote for. I want you to go vote. I want you to make your voice heard, no matter what it is. We could believe entirely different things. I don't care. I want you to vote. I want you to make your voice heard. Small actions can spark major social change. Consider Rosa Parks in 1955. Her decision not to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus wasn't part of a grand orchestrated movement at that moment. It was a simple personal act of defiance. And yes, I'm aware of things around that too, but again, not going into it, perfect example. But that one small action ignited the Montgomery bus boycott, which in turn became a crucial catalyst for the civil rights movement. It shows that what feels like a single isolated decision can ripple outward, changing society at its core. Change takes time, but it happens. It's easy to feel disillusioned when systemic changes seem slow. But real change is often incremental. And I will say that I think people lose sight or lose focus of how things have changed. I'll hear people talking about how bad things are, but they're not zooming out and looking at how far we've come in the last 20 years, the last 30 years, the last 40 years, the last 50 years. Society has changed at an incredible rate of speed. And we are not designed, we did not evolve to handle that rate of change. But I think people forget it because they only look at the here and now. They're only worried about themselves. They have very little to no self-awareness. They don't consider how their actions impact others on all sides of the fence. People are who they are. It's podcasts like this that try to show you a better way to be. And unfortunately, the people that need the information often dismiss it, label it, look at any little thing that they can pick apart that might be wrong to invalidate the whole thing. Took me a long time to move past that, and instead of trying to help those people, just letting them go. It took me a long time to move past that, but I have. I do feel sorry for them, but at the end of the day, I can give them the tools. I can try to teach them how to use the tools, and then I got to walk away. Got to protect my own energy. Look at the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century. It took decades of persistent advocacy, protests, and organizing by many women and men. But in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women the right to vote. Many of the suffragettes who worked tirelessly for this change didn't even live to see the victory, but their efforts laid the foundation for future generations. Voting is about more than electing a president. Significant change happens at the local and state levels, often with even smaller margins of difference. For example, in 2017, the Virginia House of Delegates race between David Yancey and Shelley Simmons ended in a tie, literally a single vote, would have decided the outcome before the race went to a tiebreaker. Local elections frequently come down to razor-thin margins, where just a few votes can decide key issues like education, public safety, and infrastructure. Voting is a right, not a chore. Reflect on the struggles and sacrifices made to secure voting rights for various groups. From women's suffrage to the civil rights movement, many fought long and hard for the right to vote. The fight to secure voting rights continues today, as marginalized groups still face voter suppression and gerrymandering. I don't know why we don't have an app to vote. You could literally put in your biometrics, your GPS location. Every phone has, or every piece of hardware has different MAC address. You could bring that in. There are so many ways you could make this secure so that everyone just has an app. You would not be able to do it on a computer. There's too much fuckery that can happen with that. But on your personal mobile device, there are tons of different ways that you could make it secure. You could have a blockchain in the background, so all the records are there and irrefutable because everyone with the app has the blockchain ledger on their phone. I mean, we can do this. There's no reason we cannot do this. There's a lack of socio-political willpower to do it. That's the only reason. Exercising that right to vote isn't just about political outcomes. It's about honoring the legacy of those who came before and continuing their work for equality. By shifting the focus from personal disillusionment to collective power, voters can break free from the belief that their participation is meaningless. While one vote may not single-handedly change the world, history shows that millions of individual actions, even seemingly small ones, can steer the course of a nation. Conclusion: breaking the cycle of learned helplessness. Recognizing and breaking free from learned helplessness is essential to reclaiming power, especially in a democracy. By understanding how this mindset can impact your choices, we can begin to re-engage with the political process. Local elections show us that a small, motivated group of voters can wield significant influence, sometimes deciding critical outcomes that affect everyone. This makes every vote more important than ever, particularly when such low percentages of the population are required for measures to pass. 8%? Are you kidding me? It's critical to reflect on whether disengagement is a product of learned helplessness or a conscious, informed choice. If it's the former, the next step is to push back against the feeling of powerlessness. To realize that change, though slow, happens when people collectively take small, impactful actions. Voting is not just a right. It's a form of personal self-agency. It allows individuals to be part of something bigger, to contribute to the larger societal shifts that shape the future. It's about moving from helplessness to action, and from disengagement to impact. The power is, and always has been, in your hands. Thank you.